Hi everyone, welcome to the Navigant Credit Union Broadcast Center. I'm GoLocal News Editor Kate Nagel. I'd like to welcome in a familiar face, GoLocal Prof columnist
Kate.
Bob
Nice
Wickham.
to see you. Nice to see you.
Thanks for coming in this Friday afternoon to chat all things news and politics and
I have to be back home at the ACI in an hour though, so let's move this along.
Before we talk about Cranston, I want to talk about the New York Times, the piece, the opinion piece, anonymously published.
I hate it. I hate anonymous pieces. I say a few words about this in my next column. That's not the way to do it. What we need is people to resign on principle, have a press conference, go into details about why they're leaving, why they've left. This is not the way to do it. It also sort of implies we're going to have the staff, the president's staff, acting in the position of president, which is not good. It's not healthy.
I think that was seemed the crux of it, that it was the resistance that
totally
that person was
totally inappropriate. I mean, you know, we got ourselves in this fix. There are constitutional ways. There's obviously impeachment, and then there's the 25th Amendment, and it may be time to start thinking about the 25th Amendment. By the way, I have to keep repeating, and I mentioned this to Josh Fenton many times. He understands. My beefs with the Trump administration are actually not so much, well, I disagree with some of the policies, it's characterological. It's basically a criminal conspiracy. The biggest crook ever elected president. That's the problem. But anyway, the way to deal with it is not to have these, these mystery op-eds, no name, which undermines the credibility of the New York Times. And of course, the base thinks this is some sort of commie plot.
Do you think the
to
general
remove their
public
great leader? Yeah, big mistake.
Gets that though, from a journalistic standpoint?
We
would never, I'm saying here, likely do it.
No.
The issue is you don't have obviously someone's name associated with it, and the allegations that are made therein. I'm not saying the New York Times.
It'll raise the paranoia too of a man who is profoundly paranoid,
so now,
which may cause even more bizarre behavior because he's so paranoid.
Well, if there wasn't already a contentious relationship between the president and the press, and the New York Times in particular, it's clearly reached, I think, nuclear level.
That's right. Yeah, H-bomb. Absolutely. No, I think it was a huge mistake, and I very much wish that person, whoever it is, man or woman, probably a man, resign promptly, resign now, apologize for doing that anonymously, and then explain to the American public what the problem is. Openly take questions, too. Take questions from New York Times reporters.
Would you ever thought you would envision
I would never have done that. I would never run an anonymous. Now, sometimes I've used anonymous sources, and I'm writing a story, but then I'm taking the blame for it. My byline over the piece.
Absolutely.
You
got to own it.
The reporter, the journalist, or the columnist, whatever, you're quoting anonymous, and then you've got to be able to back it up. And I've never heard of anything quite like this.
So, speaking of First Amendment issues and rights, GoLocal just published a video that was put forth by an anonymous individual in Cranston, calling it a First Amendment audit. He was outside of the Rhode Island National Guard on his phone for about 15 minutes, clearly taking some imagery. The Cranston police show up. And he's doing this as this litmus test, if you will, and they say, what are you doing here, and can we have some ID? He says, I don't have to give you ID.
Absolutely right.
And so he says, I don't have to give you ID, and so they said, well, we got this call, someone's suspicious outside. He's like, I know my rights, and that's why I'm here.
That's right. Yeah,
so,
it's not against the law to stand outside.
But where is that line? We've reached out to the Cranston police for comment on this. He's done this around the country. He's got a YouTube channel. It's called First Amendment Audits, clearly trying to see different police departments around the country.
Well, good for him for doing that. I think that's a public service.
And she says, well, looks like maybe you were suspicious. And he goes, am I being accused of committing a crime? That's the only way in which you can get an ID. And she said, well, no, but we want to make sure you don't. So it escalates.
Assuming he wasn't acting bizarrely, so far as we know. Was he?
It was walking outside the National Guard.
Did he take off his clothes? He was clothed, right?
I believe he was
clothed.
Okay,
he was clothed. He wasn't brandishing a gun or a knife.
Was taking video.
Taking video.
Taking video,
well,
and they said that was suspicious. So it escalated. He wanted the officer's name. Again, continued to refuse to give ID. Again, said, am I being accused of a crime? It did not consent to search and seizure. I believe they did put hands on him to obtain the phone. Did end up with him being arrested.
That's not good. That's not good. I don't know why they would do that. And now they're going to get themselves in trouble.
Well, again, he goes around the country to do this for this very reason. And it's this day and age of video and YouTube and But, you know, back in the day, would have never seen it happen if there wasn't a phone.
That's right.
So,
that's right. Yeah, you'd run down, 10 blocks to the nearest payphone. You put quarters in. That's right. I remember those days. They weren't fun, I'll tell you that. What did Mayor Fung say about this, since that's in his burg?
We're waiting to hear now back from Cranston. The police department has been notified, and we're going to see what they have to say about this matter. Speaking of quarters, speaking of nickels and dimes.
Nickel and diming.
Well, you're like, where is she going with this? Care New England, several months ago.
Bad shape.
Well, it puts out the report that they're righting the ship and things are hunky-dory, and they tell the audience that things are fine at Care New England, and then they then go to the Department of Health and say, we're in dire distress.
It's apocalypse now, right?
Apocalypse now, please expedite the Hospital Conversion Act as soon as possible.
And then they get merged into partners. And then, of course, 15 or 20 seconds later, Partners takes over Lifespan, too. So we have one hospital company.
Imagine if it's within the letter of the law. They know the criteria, which makes it distress. But to read the other piece that they put out in August and said we're, getting efficiencies of scale and things are looking good.
We've just executed 2/3 of the staff and everything's broad sunlit uplands.
I'm assuming this is of no surprise to you being in this industry.
No, not really. But I think the most interesting thing is not so much Care New England, which of course the second big hospital chain in Rhode Island. Actually, there are only two real chains. In Westerly, it's not really part of Yale New Haven, but is again, Lifespan, which is much bigger, the possibility, and I would guess the probability that Partners will take that over, which means effectively that healthcare, except for Westerly, will be run from Boston. That's what it means. From that great big MGH building.
Moving forward, I believe I saw a Lifespan sponsor sticker on those new electric bikes.
Yeah. Really? Right.
Yeah,
why? What's the point of that? What do you mean? You mean being on an electric bike is good for your health?
I don't get it.
Yeah. You mean on the Bird? No. Those little Bird things?
We have yet to see Bird come back to Providence.
That's too bad.
I mean, I haven't seen you in your scooter lately.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Well, I'm usually an armored personnel carrier.
You're in an armored vehicle.
That's right. Have to be.
So you've got your cheat sheet here.
Yeah, a few things. I'm going to talk about one thing that's very entertaining, and I'm not sucking up. I'm not an employee, but GoLocal had a kind of mock editorial about the construction of the Industrial Trust Building, and condemning this. This would be a terrible thing if they built this in the mid-20s. They have to tear down a historic building to put it up, and this would just be awful. This would be a terrible thing, and now, of course, everyone's trying to save it, even though it's utterly uneconomic. And I think the point of this is very simple, which is that all old buildings used to be new. They used to do new buildings.
They used to be new and shocking.
And this clearly was, the mock editorial is clearly a reference to Jason Fain's plan for a 46-story skyscraper on the 195 area and 195 relocation area. So, somewhat similar complaints that you'd read in the mock editorial. I think it would be fun to go back. You'd have to go into the archives, the Providence Journal, and some other publications at the time, and find out how much pushback there was. I know there was a building, the Butler Building, the Butler Exchange, where the Providence Public Library used to be, and historic 19th century structure, and I know there was some gnashing of teeth about the tearing down of that. So, it'd be fun to get even more context about this, but people, especially in an old city like Providence, which has a powerful preservation society, and a lot of people live here because they like the old buildings, they do forget that, everything had to start sometime, and that with the economy, changing architecture, changing city planning, and so on and so forth, most buildings are eventually torn down.
Well, we'll see what happens, but I'll tell you, Fiend, back to committee, GoLocal reporter Rachel Newlands.
I thought they were just going to kill it. That actually surprised me.
Yeah, it was.
Were you surprised?
I was very surprised. I thought it was either going to be one way or the other. But back to committee again. Need more information. Need a little judicial review. I don't know what else.
Well, I think they're still. I mean, they're powerful opponents to this thing, and they're kind of well placed. Some of the east side, but also they're. A lot of people think this is a great thing, and especially with the Pawsox not, leaving town, maybe maybe some of those people think, well, we need one big project. We need something to get people excited about.
This is probably, I would say, the biggest political football at the moment.
Yeah.
And they just punted again.
Yeah, I think they're going to kill it, actually. Given the intensity of opposition from 2 or 3 powerful groups. And of course, a lot of the realtors, the local realties are terrified because they fear that will basically rent itself. The owners will rent itself.
They won't need them.
They won't need the realtors, and they won't need the realtors for their 6%. So I think that has something to do with it. Yeah.
Okay, so we talked about, let's see, the editorial about Superman fame. What else do we have about that?
Yeah. Well, there's a wonderful, a couple of really local interests. Senator Raptakis was in here the other day talking to you, I think, about schools should open later. Well, for one thing, schools used to open after Labor Day. In my time, I don't know about your time, my time. Admittedly, that was right after the Civil War. They used to open a day or two after Labor Day. They certainly could do that again. And he said, well, it's because it tends to be hotter in late August and early September than it is in June. I think what we need is some sort of comparative climatological analysis.
A real scientific analysis of this.
No, comparing the temperatures in late June with the temperatures from, say, August 25th to September 8th, something like that.
As you said, directly after the Civil War, when you went back after Labor Day, I mean, temps have been increasing. There's no two ways about it.
That's right, they have been. That's a very good point.
It's clearly delineated, whatever your political or scientific view is, the temperatures have been increasing.
That's right, gradually, but
So I think you're right. I think it needs to take a look at what that is. But how are the schools themselves, whether you're sweating it out in June or whether you're sweating it out in August?
There's another issue, which is social equity issue, which is many of the schools in the poorer places are not air conditioned. Maybe the principal's office is air conditioned. While the schools in the rich towns, East Greenwich and so on, tend to be air conditioned, much more air conditioning. And of course, the rich kids go to the fancy private schools. They're all taken care of. And as temperatures rise, this inequity becomes, to me, more serious because it's hard to learn. It's hard to learn in a room where it's 95 degrees. And with the warming continuing, and we can have hot days into early October.
Absolutely. I mean, it's literally. I think the conversation is how can schools accommodate heat.
The equity.
And the calendar dates sort of are kind of secondary.
I mean, a lot of these buildings are ancient. They've got asbestos in them. There's probably some lead in the pipes. I mean, we really do need a massive rebuild of a lot of these structures.
Speaking of schools, the terrible tragedy this week outside the Providence Prayer in Tech. You've seen leaders come out decrying it. You seem to see it across the country, and then when it happens here, it's what do we do?
I don't think you can do much, frankly. I know that's not the appropriate, maybe not the proper sounding answer, but with so many guns around and with little inclination by policymakers to do anything about it, and with all this sort of social dysfunction, poverty, and gangs and so on, I don't think anything can be done about it. It's going to keep happening. As you know, there's a big shooting the other day in Cincinnati, not at a school. But with so many guns around and the ease of doing this, and with the an underclass that's very poor and is vulnerable to crime, you're going to find more and more of this. I suppose you could say, well, put more cops in the streets. That wouldn't have stopped this.
It just happened.
Yeah,
right?
it just happened.
Poor young man was in the wrong place.
Yeah, somebody just goes crazy. Could be commission of another crime. Some of the stuff, a lot of this stuff, is just mental illness. Someone's got a gun, and if you have a gun, hey,
Well, you see, gun rights supporters oftentimes point to Chicago, where probably the strictest gun laws in the country, and say, Chicago.
They aren't that strict in a sense because it's so easy to get guns. It's like Washington, D.C. has always had a high murder rate because they get their guns from Virginia. So, I mean, when it's so easy, you don't have to, I spent some time in Chicago, you don't have to go very far to get a gun. And, they also have, of course, tremendous, you've got this huge slum, mostly African-American slum, huge disparities, and, the wealth and the prosperity there is very much concentrated along the lake, Michigan Avenue and the Loop, and so it's terrible. There's also, I think, a certain tradition of crime, street crime in Chicago. It's been around for a long time.
It is unfortunately nothing new, and you know, our condolences out to the family.
It's very sad. Yeah, and a couple of things. You know, the booze report in the Lancet, you know, the British Medical Journal. Well, apparently the science is ridiculous, and you know, the conclusions seem to be nobody should ever drink anything. You know, for health reasons. In fact, the data turned out to be skewed. So I analyzed
You'll drink to that.
Not that I'm any expert, but a very bright reporter for Vox, the online news service, talked to a whole bunch of epidemiologists and
well, you know, don't you always see the 106-year-olds? They're at the nursing home, and they say, "How do you? It's my daily glass of scotch."
That's right, 2 old fashions. And there's a story. There's another story. I think maybe of well, there are so many stories maybe of interest. Tangier Island in the Chesapeake, you're probably familiar with, is gradually going underwater. And because it's really because of rising seas, because of global warming, they're blaming it on erosion as rising seas, you know, erosion on top of rising seas. And there's this wishful thinking, they don't want to leave, and they're just not accepting this. While people in the Point section of Newport, who obviously have much more money, since hedge funders generally make more money than crabbers do, how they're addressing this by, you know, elevating buildings, and they're, you know, doing all this amazing stuff. And I sort of give this comparison. There's a book out by, well, I can't remember, Mr. Swift or something, about Tangier Island going under. And it's absolutely fascinating, and that's where a lot of the blue crab, meaning soft-shell crab, which I'm sure you have when you were in Washington. You know, you get the mallet.
You sit outside, you get the fries, and the crabs, and
rolling
the
rock beer,
and
the whole thing, lemon, and all that stuff. That's great stuff. And if do I have time for one more?
Do.
Okay. And a couple of, oh yeah, there's a great, I know I probably overdo this mass transit stuff, but Barry Bluestone, an economist at BU, did a great story about why drivers should pay more for mass transit. Why in terms of higher gasoline taxes and tolls, because obviously the more mass transit, the less traffic.
The less drivers.
The less traffic. And they could actually save themselves money if they push politicians to raise tolls, raise the gasoline tax, because they wouldn't be stuck in traffic all the time.
Well, we're all going to be in driverless cars in 5 years anyhow.
I hope so, yeah. Or in my driverless armored personnel carrier. That's right.
We'll see Bob swinging around.
That's right.
Well, appreciate, as always, Bob Whitcomb, you're coming in here to the Navigate Credit Union Broadcast Center.
Great to see. Have a nice weekend.
We'll have a great weekend. And we're going to wrap up here in the Navigate Credit Union Broadcast Center. We'll see you next week.